April 18th, 2017. Update 9.18 is released. At the time, no one could have known it would have been the most impactful update they'd ever make, but somewhat unfortunately, it was, and still is. Well, we could go on and on about the other parts of this update, some of which I've already discussed in great lengths, and other parts of it are a story for another day. We're going to focus on this one. Tier 10 light tanks was one of the most anticipated updates that people had been waiting for, and they'd been waiting for quite a long time. At the time, it was the only branch that didn't have tier 10s yet, since SPGs had gotten them many years prior, and medium tanks even before that. People had really high hopes for them, since they were always matched a tier above, and they were quite powerful for what they were designed to do, and also a little bit extra. Initially, people were not disappointed, and for a few reasons. A lot of tanks were moved up a tier, so the grind was shortened by an entire tank for those who had had them all knocked already. Additionally, any of the new tanks at lower tiers were free as well, in case they ever wanted to go back and get them. Overall, for this update, there was a lot to like. Consumables were multiple use, artillery didn't one-shot you anymore, light tanks could get top tier for real now, and it wasn't a fluke. Overall, people loved it, and rightfully they should have. That initial reaction lasted quite a while, until people started to realize what they'd done to light tanks to warrant moving them up a tier or changing them to be what they were now. Some light tanks remained completely unchanged, but they were absolutely in the minority. A lot of the tanks in this list being shown in the background are SPGs, since they also changed them in this update, but at least half of them are changes to light tanks. Sparing you the time of reading that thesis of patch notes, the changes generally to every tank were a nerf to the firepower, and most getting buffs to their mobility in terms of like engine power. A lot of them got top speed nerfs. Overall, as a class, light tanks became kind of less enjoyable to play overnight. Many vehicles that were people's favorites were essentially completely gutted and left to rot. Some of these vehicles would return to the game, albeit not in the same state as how they left it. These vehicles are the subject of today's video. We'll go by nation and discuss what changed tank to tank, as long as it's notably significant for how the tank played before compared to now. The Chinese lights were already pretty generic, so a lot of their changes just made them slightly worse at doing what they were already doing, which already wasn't that great anyway. Most of the changes were just making their guns worse, their engines better, and view range sometimes getting worse as well. The only real notable change here was what they did to the 5916 and how they somehow made it worse by buffing it. Yes, worse, with a buff. You may be wondering how that's even possible, and I'll tell you. They gave the main gun much better penetration values, while completely removing the autoloader from it. The gun went from 106 premium pen to 180, which is, that's pretty generous. It was now less accurate and fired significantly less often due to not being an autoloader. The only real edge this tank had over others was that auto-loading mechanic, which was largely the reason to play it, especially if you'd already gotten past it and wanted to come back. It was unique in some way, and while the tank itself wasn't anything particularly great, it was unique, which was enough for some people to hang on to it. Once that was gone, the tank was dead. Since they also added 2 light tanks a line, or shifted them around, but typically added 2 tanks a line, they added a tier 9 and a tier 10 to this line. And they are not special in any way pretty much whatsoever, and are regarded as nearly worst in class by a lot of players, since they possess no unique qualities to set them apart from their peers. In some regards, they are directly worse, such as their accuracy statistics, and also likewise, their camo ratings aren't as good as some of the other lights either. The Russian light tanks were one of the nations that didn't really have a lot of autoloaders, but what they did have still got removed. The MT-25 had a nearly completely useless autoloader with no appealing qualities whatsoever, like none, unless you found a light tank, CDC or Borsig, in which case you proceeded to absolutely obliterate them from full health in 5 seconds, and we didn't care that it cost the equivalent of a down payment on a house because it was funny. Really missed that gun. The LTTB was one of the only light tanks in the game where you could moderately reliably take it into city brawls and actually block shots because of how the armor was shaped. Most people could just shoot it because it was a light tank, which led to quite a few steel wall games happening. With this update, the tank was moved from a tier 7 to a tier 8, and the LTG being put at tier 7 instead, which, that's, you know, that thing is fine, I guess. The view range and firepower on the LTTB were both nerfed, which means, yes, the tank was moved up a tier and was worse at a base level than it was a tier lower. But hey, at least it could mount vert stabs now, right? The T50 was a tier 4 and got moved to tier 5. It only got buffed in pretty much every way, and no one entirely cares, so I won't bother making a long spiel about it. I just figured I'd mention it because I like the tank, and because it still got put into the collector tab later, so while it did avoid the wrath of this update, still got hit on the way back around. If you watch the Wargaming League Grand Finals, I forget the specific year it was, the T54 Lightweight was the king of that event, and rarely was it substituted out for pretty much anything else. The only real alternative people ever seemed to use was a T49, we'll get to that one later, or 2 tier 7s, which, again, we'll get to that one later, because it was 2 Bulldogs. The combination of really good camo, plus being able to brawl, and being very fast, made it the go-to tank for almost any engagement you really wanted to use or play or find yourself in. In this update, it was moved to tier 9, given better engine power and 50 more hit points. The tank was so strong at tier 8, those were the only things that changed about it. As a tier 9, it's still good, but it wasn't what it used to be prior to that change. It went from, like, super meta brawling competitive to honestly rare usage. I don't really see them anymore. Ultimately, it's not all bad. We got the LTG, like I said before, and that thing's fine. It's not the greatest tank in the world, but it's pretty middle of the road as far as light tanks go. I don't really think anyone will complain about having a fairly average light tank, because it's not super camouflaged and it's not super uncamouflaged. It doesn't have the greatest firepower in the world, but there's definitely worse, like the setter. We also got the T100 at the end of the branch, which turned out to be the best light tank in the entire game for a while. The Russians, like the Chinese, didn't really have that many unique qualities within their light tanks, but still got hit pretty hard. You can kind of tell how bad it's going to be for other nations if nearly every tank in this line got a nerf of some kind, and it's only being talked about second out of 5. The French line of light tanks was in a weird state after the changes, because in a way they were better, in another way they were far worse. The firepower of the French light tanks was the main draw, especially when compared to other light tanks in the same tier. You could get in, hit your shots, and get out. A good player could very easily play around the weakness of having to reload for a long time, and be very, very effective by doing that. Removing 2 shells in the drum for all 3 AMX tanks in the line was an interesting change. On one hand, there was a lower damage output per clip, 33% less than before at maximum effectiveness. On the other hand, that's 5 less seconds to spend firing, and quite a few less seconds reloading. In a DPM sense, they are more efficient, which autoloaders are notoriously bad at, but are worse in single engagement fights, which means you have to go find people more often. There were a lot of changes to all 3 of them, but overall they all got changed the same. The only notable thing otherwise is the AMX 1390 going from tier 8 to tier 9, and getting much better dispersion values than it previously had. I originally missed the old 1390 because it had more damage, until I went back and watched replays and saw it had horrible dispersion, like truly horrible dispersion values. And now it's not, you know, a laser missile system, but it's pretty accurate compared to what it was before. The tank replacing the AMX 1390 at tier 8 was the Batchat 12 ton, which is kind of weird because up until that point we only had the 25 ton. The tank itself was and still is perfectly fine. At worst, it's pretty much average at almost everything, but it has an autoloader, when the autoloader's pretty good. The problem was, when it first came out, it led to 3 tier 9s, and the research cost was increased. You had to grind out over 600,000 experience in just one tank, making it the longest tech tree single tank grind in the entire game by over double the next tank. It was very common to find people with upwards of 800 games in the tank, at least, just to finish the grind. Most tech trees cost around 700 to 720,000 XP for the entire thing, tier 1 to 10, just to give a sense of scale of how much that is. This was also a time where either blueprints hadn't quite come out yet, or had just come out, so you really couldn't shorten that by that much. And even if blueprints were out at that point, they really didn't give out a lot of them yet. The tier 10 we got is essentially just another copy-paste of the rest of the line, which, I mean, it fits, so I'm not going to complain. Yet again, with another gun than the previous tank in the line. This time it only has 3 shells, since they wanted to keep the theme of removing 2 shells, and the Batchat 25 has 5. Overall, it's fine, and it fits the theme of the branch, so no complaints here from me. I think the French got off pretty easy, all things considered. Then, of course, they added a second branch that completely overshadowed it for like 2 years at least, but, you know, details. I think the American light tanks are probably the first thing you thought of if you thought about this video's concept and have played enough light tanks to know what they each could do, at least back then. I also bet there's one light tank in particular that you have on your mind, because it's pretty glaringly obvious something's very wrong with the balance of tier 8 lights. Enter the Walker Bulldog. As a tier 7 light tank, it had a 10-shot autoloader, which put out some serious damage, but then had to reload for a long time. It didn't have good camo, it had amazing firepower to make up the gap. It was moved to tier 8 and essentially given no buffs, on top of removing that amazing gun. Typically, when a light tank has worse concealment, they tend to be larger, and it tends to have better firepower than normal lights. This is how stuff like the Char MLE is balanced, and also the T49, which we'll get to in a minute. That was no longer the case after this update, and it remains that way to this day. The M41 Bulldog light tank barely gets better moving concealment than a T95. It has the worst damage output potential of almost any tier 5 light tank, as well as the worst concealment. The tank has been neutered so hard, the Type 64 tier 6 light tank has higher third mark requirements as a tier 6 light tank in tier 6 matchmaking with way less hit points to work with. It's amazing they've never sold the old one as a premium tank, even a tier higher. Like, even if it wasn't a tier 7 anymore, people would buy that thing immediately because it was way more fun and interesting to play than what we have now, which is what people cared about with it, besides the fact it was just good, because it was. The Bulldog was moved up to tier 8, which pushed the T49 up to tier 9. The speed was nerfed, and the guns didn't really get any help to fill that gap either. Sure, it still has the derp, they didn't actually remove that, but the derp worked great because it was at tier 8. You could still make it work now with the newer equipment that's come out, but it's not what it used to be. Having 152 pen tier 8 is very good for a derp gun like that, on a light tank especially. Having 152 at tier 9 is not the same. Since the tier 7 was moved up to tier 8, which moved the tier 8 up to tier 9, they needed a replacement at tier 7. Not to be outdone by the absolute mediocrity that is what became of the Walker Bulldog, Wargaming introduced the T71 CMCD, the luxury sports hybrid model T71, which was worse in basically every single way to the normal T71. It also had all the same problems of the T71, what few ones it had, such as the traverse speed sometimes being a little too much. For starters, 5,600 credits per gold round. Why? Just why? Like, it's not that special of a round. It's 210 pen heat round on a light tank. It's really not that special. So why does it cost more credits than a T110E3's shell? It has no real damage output besides DPM, I guess, which, I mean, sure, if someone gets shot over and over again like that, fair enough. Not a lot of camo, and alright view range, which is, you know, common with American light tanks. It's a very generic and equally as underwhelming tank that nobody has ever cared about. Most people forget that the T-37 also had an autoloader, but it did until this update. Ever since then, it's basically been a worse medium tank tier for tier. I've not seen one in months. Because if you want to play one of those, people either play a Super Chaffee, which they got for free, or they play, you know, anything else. At this point, Britain didn't even have a proper light tank line yet, and even they got in the crossfire, with the Crusader being turned into a medium tank. For no reason, because they then reverted this anyway, so I don't really know what the point of this was. Consider this kind of just an honorable mention before the main event. Speaking of, Germany. Holy crap. They didn't forget World War II, that's for sure. Just to start, they made the RU-251 a tier 9 and made it slower, which was the only stat it had that was unique anyway, is that it was the fastest tank in the game. They later released a tier 8 premium light tank that is essentially what the old RU-251 was, thus completely obsoleting the existence of this thing besides the good pen and the HE rounds. The tier 8 that replaced it was essentially a copy-paste of the tier 7 put one tier higher, with the same gun. The tier 7 got heavily nerfed in every regard and removed the tank's autoloader. This near exact same gun that got removed would return on a tier 8 premium, the ELC even 90. It's not an exact pull it off one tank, stick it on the other, but it's as close as you're gonna get, down to the fact it has almost the same pen. While the tank is fine now, I actually really enjoy playing it, it's not the tank it used to be. And the unique feature of the tank being copy-pasted onto a premium tank was a bad sign of what wargaming would start doing more of after this point. The VK2801, yeah, that thing, you know where this is going if you play the game currently, may have gotten hit the hardest out of any of the German tanks, which is saying a lot because they got hit pretty hard across the board. The tank received nerfs of varying degrees, but the biggest one of all was the removal of its 105mm derp gun. Overnight, the tank had its only interesting and unique feature completely removed, making it another giant light tank with the same alpha as everybody else. This tank would then make a return, in a nerf state, as a well-deserved reward. While it was nice the tank was free, instead of being sold like a lot of other tanks they've done this with at this point, it begs the question why they did it in the first place. If it's fine now, then why did it warrant changing in the first place? I'll continue on that topic in a second, but I did want to point out the tier 10 in this line. As soon as climbing was removed, fully, the tank was completely irrelevant until a few months ago. The one bonus it had over other light tanks was its speed, and that got obsoleted by the EBRs in patch 1.2. Otherwise, it was just a worse leopard in every way for many years, up until very recently. I did also want to take a moment to comment on the Super Chaffee, like I mentioned earlier. The Super Chaffee was the old Tier 5 Chaffee from many years ago, back when Tier 5 was as high as light tanks actually went. That was a long time ago. It is heavily nerfed down and put a tier higher. The tanks they've nerfed in years past, as well as remove, change, etc., keep getting put back into the game how they were before. They slap a nostalgia sticker on them and then you pay $40 for them sometimes. The changes that were supposed to benefit light tanks ended up removing all of their unique features, and what we ended up with is tanks built to only be scouts with mediocre firepower, with rare exception. Since tanks aren't all built the exact same, some are better than others, and these changes that were mostly to firepower took away any advantage a lot of these tanks had over each other. While they weren't supposed to have a high amount of firepower, you know, being a light tank, they weren't supposed to be damage-dealing machines. They had the capability of defending themselves a lot better back then than they do now. Almost every single Tier 6 light tank gets either 110 or 115 average alpha damage, with a lot of the slower reloads being on the tanks that are worse in spotting. There's no reason to play half of them. There's no reason to play half the Tier 7 lights either, considering there's also mediums now that do the same thing, as well as premiums. Most tech tree Tier 8 lights aren't as good as some premiums either, and those premiums sometimes have features the old tanks had. This is also an issue with wargaming not being able to nerf premiums. Sorry, explicitly deciding to not nerf premiums, despite stating in their EULA they could do it with no repercussions whatsoever. Of course, when you nerf or change, all the tanks to be sort of the same, but refuse to nerf premium tanks, it's not hard to see why that might be a balance issue. Anyway, back to the main point, because we got sidetracked. What was supposed to be a huge update for light tanks turned into a class killer overnight. And that might be a little overdramatic, but let me finish. That was then put to rest when the EBRs were put into the game. Originally, they had no light tank matchmaking weight, so they just ruined everybody at higher tiers. In a world where all light tanks are designed with the same firepower, the winner is the stealthiest or the fastest. Since every single tank was made super generic, save for a few, they were all mostly subpar compared to the Tokyo drifting Frenchman they just added to the game. The Sheridan, which was so irrelevant ever since it came out, I didn't even mention it earlier, was played sometimes 8% as often as the EBR 105 during 60-day time period records. It didn't do anything better than an EBR 105, except for maybe gun depression, but who cares? And thus was never played. The only use it served was for Object 279 Campaign Mission 15, which is getting ace tankers, and even then it was easier to do something in like a T69. Because it was a good tank, it was just never played. In the span of under 2 years, light tanks went from one of the most interesting and rewarding experiences a player could learn and master to just being downright frustrating most of the time, with bits of satisfaction sprinkled in there. What was once a very balanced class, since it was so diverse, turned into a one tank beats all kind of meta at higher tiers, with the tiers underneath being either straight up bad or not special in any way. Even before the wheeled or British light tanks came out, the T100 was the best scout in the game, bar none. It was the only light tank used in Clan Wars, simply because it was the smallest and the sneakiest. You'd see a lot of other light tanks in random matches, partially because they were new, but because it was still possible to do well with them all for a short while. Once people adjusted to the new vehicles and figured out which ones were better at which things, all bets were off, and people stopped playing the worst ones entirely, because they'd often lose scout 1v1s. Some of you don't have to imagine this, and I apologize if you subjected yourself through that without realizing what your end goal was. But imagine grinding out 800,000 experience in a time before there were daily missions that gave you like 1,000 free XP just because. Just for your reward to be the worst tier 10 in the game at the time, being the Rheinmetall Panzerwagen. And you had to go through the Hawk 12, which was the tier 7 at tier 8, and an RU-251, which was literally a tier 8 at tier 9. Why should you even bother? Why should you play the Sheridan when the T-49 was a more interesting experience in general and had the derp gun as well? Fast forward just over a year, why should you bother getting almost any light tank except the EBR 105 if you have scouting missions? Some of you might be saying, well, yeah, that's the point. No. No. Like, you can't have one that's just better than all the others. That ruins almost everything. And yeah, they've been nerfed now, but when they originally came out, you know how broken they were. That's why you were playing it, if you did play it. Adding tier 10 light tanks on paper was a great change, and probably still is to this day. What they did in that patch to every other tier ruined it. The diversity and interest was gone, and made playing light tanks very aggravating. In a lot of situations, on a lot of maps, almost any similar medium tank would be immediately better for the given situation. And rarely does a battle get changed or carried by a light tank, save for the select few maps we can all name off the top of our head because they're very designated to being light tank maps. So, overall, I guess for an interesting light tank experience, you're gonna have a pretty slim selection, save for, of course, a decent number of premium tanks. Thanks for update 9.18, More Gaming. You made a vase out of a plate and still expected us to eat off of it. Anyway, holy crap, now that that's over, thanks for watching all the way to the end. Normally I wouldn't make a video with a more serious tone like this that's kind of borderline ranty, but I think they did light tanks really dirty in that patch and a couple afterwards. Speaking of dirty, the subscribe button has some gunk on it, and you should click on it to knock some of the cobwebs off. Okay, right, that was super cheesy. Okay, holy crap.